OES acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work, teach and learn. We acknowledge First Nations peoples and the important contributions that they make to education and learning.
Sometimes it's hard to find meaning in the work that we do at university. So much of it is a general understanding, but the further you get into your degree, the more niche your work becomes. As an aspiring sustainability consultant, I have hope for what AI can bring to the industry.
As a law student, I am absolutely concerned about the growing role of AI and my future work opportunities. This is just because of extensive discourse that's been had recently about the capability of AI to take over a number of human jobs. And it worries me that employment opportunities in areas like administration, for instance, will become less frequent and just overall more difficult to attain.
I think overall I feel quite positive about the future use of AI in the context of my kind of work and my degree. I guess I do have concerns about people's ability to have kind of critical thinking skills and whether those are kind of degraded through the use of AI. But overall, I think in terms of the ability of AI to reduce kind of monotonous administrative work, letters that are repetitive, reports that are repetitive, I think it's got a lot of benefits.
I know that my degree will help me in the future. Although there have been aspects of it which I felt at the time I didn't really understand their value. In retrospect, when I'm able to discuss complex economics, discuss geopolitics, what's happening in the world and the theory behind it, having this awareness and the ability to pick apart information, especially from the media, is really, really valuable.
I'm absolutely confident in the ability of my degree to reflect what I can do in the real world post-graduation. I think university degrees still hold a lot of prestige in society today, and I hope and I believe rather that attaining a university degree can show employers that you're dedicated, that you have a real passion in a particular area, and so I do continue to believe that a university degree is relevant for sure.
Hello, I'm Amanda Ford from Online Education Services. Thanks for joining us for the final episode of this season of The Thought Bubble. Across the series, we've been exploring a big question. How do we continue to build confidence in higher education as AI reshapes how students learn and how that learning is assessed and recognised? When assurance is integrated at a program level, the conversation shifts. It moves away from focusing on whether AI is creating shortcuts and towards how we enable students to learn and demonstrate their capability in meaningful ways. Because assurance decisions aren't neutral. They shape who gets to participate, who persists, and how institutions make claims about learning, and how those claims are trusted. And that means this conversation is not just about institutions managing risk. It's about the kind of higher education system we want to sustain. In this final episode, we zoom back out and ask the biggest question of all. Who does assurance of learning ultimately serve? At its core, assurance exists to support confidence in learning claims. For students, that confidence matters because it underpins the value of their qualifications. For institutions, it supports defensible academic judgment. And for the system, it sustains trust in higher education outcomes over time. What this means in practice will differ across students and programs. But the assurance decisions institutions make still shape how learning is designed, how progress is supported, and how capability is ultimately recognised. Across this series, you've heard directly from students about how AI is showing up in their studies and how they experience university in different modes of learning in 2026. Because maintaining trust depends upon taking student perspectives seriously and understanding how assurance decisions are experienced in practice. Here are some of those student perspectives.
I think the balance at the moment is pretty good in terms of the use of AI at university. They're very clear about when and where you can use them, but overall it's ultimately just makes study a little bit easier, and it's pretty clear when you're allowed to use it, and you obviously just declare when you used it when you submitted an assignment.
Discussions in workshops and seminars about the benefits and drawbacks of AI have been invaluable. This involves students and lecturers exchanging ideas and thoughts on where the tools have been useful, where they may lead to a wrong result, and what particular tools may be appropriate for specific tasks.
I think it's essentially impossible and impractical to have a hard and fast no AI use permitted in university assignments and university tasks. I also don't think, however, that it should be free reign, and there has to be some restrictions on it, because without it, it takes away the human ability, which is what university is about.
I'm excited to be able to spend less time doing the grunt work and tasks that are repetitive and not beneficial to my growth, and instead dedicating that time to more work where I can be creative and qualitative with what I'm doing.
I would say every single day I'm at university, I'm using AI in one way, shape or form, whether it be completing simple in-class activities, researching or formatting for assignments, or even just other miscellaneous things like organisation and keeping on track. I think it's in these areas that AI can be a really helpful tool and really beneficial for students.
I guess like the constant question that I think assessments are trying to ask is like whether I've got that understanding and that knowledge base to be able to go forward in my degree.
What you hear in those voices is what's at stake. These are students navigating real trade-offs between study and work, flexibility and connection, trust and control. It's a reminder for all of us in the sector to keep listening, to actively seek student input into how programs are designed, and to use that input to test whether what we actually build supports their learning. The way assurance is designed shapes how these trade-offs are experienced. It influences whether participation is possible, whether flexibility is meaningful, and whether students feel supported as they progress through a program. This is where the idea of connected assurance becomes useful, not as a claim about tighter control, but as a way of holding learning design, assessment practices, technology and relationships together when institutions make assurance decisions. To close out the season, Rebecca Hall speaks with Claire Field, a leading expert in strategic policy across Australia's higher education, vocational training and international education sectors. Claire brings a cross-sector perspective and a clear reminder of what matters most. Assurance is not just about how we control assessment, but how we support students to genuinely learn, progress, and achieve meaningful qualifications. Claire challenges the sector to refocus on what learning actually is, how it develops over time, and how we design and assess it in ways that truly reflect student capability.
Hi, Claire Field. Thanks so much for joining us on the Thought Bubble podcast.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Today, we're talking about assurance of learning. And as you know, OES recently released a positioning paper, which included a connected assurance framework, a way for the sector to address some of the challenges that are hitting us with credibility and assurance of learning. So I guess just kicking us off, what resonates for you in that approach and how you think the sector is ready to step up to the challenges?
Well, let's talk about the first part of your question. What resonated for me in it was the fact that you've really thought about what is learning. We've had too many narrow conversations, understandably, because generative AI has taken us all by surprise. But our conversations to date have largely focused on what you've described as technical assurance, right? Making sure that students aren't cheating when they're doing their assessment. And don't get me wrong, that is not unimportant. But what I really liked about it was you talk about the relational aspect, the human relation of education and in understanding student learning, that relationship between the educator and the learner, and how that builds a pattern of someone's learning over time. And then the other part being pedagogy. And this is the bit that we have not talked about nearly enough, which is, what is it that we want students to learn? How will we know? What is it that we're trying to teach them? You know, there we were pre-COVID doing paper and pencil exams in higher education and holding hammers and hairdryers in vet. And this is an ideal opportunity, and the time is really critical for us to be thinking about all three aspects in assuring student learning. So hats off to you. Is the sector ready to step up? Parts of it are, yes.
Yep, love it. Okay, that's a good segue, I think, to another sometimes seen as a contrast. Australia collectively, we're trying to lift skills, we're trying to lift productivity, and we're trying to open access and equity at the same time. So where do you think the role of assurance and current assurance responses are helping that ambition or hindering it?
I think with encouraging students from a range of different backgrounds, those from low socioeconomic status, more disadvantaged backgrounds, into both higher education and vet is really important, and there's a range of factors that go to that. But one of the things that is important as we're trying to encourage more learners is that the system, how we teach and how we assess, continues to respond. And so if you look over the last, we can look over a decade in higher education, vet, slightly different data collection source. But what you can see is a growing trend towards students choosing more courses that are delivered online, and the world has become more digital in the last decade. If we're going to encourage a wider cohort of students, we need to be prepared to be offering them a more diverse opportunity to learn and to demonstrate their learning. So I think as we've got a big target to hit in higher education coming from the University Accord panel. In vet, we don't seem to have a target, but we are wanting more people to come and study. And if we're going to not only educate students with their first post-school qualification, but critically, changing world of work, keeping people's education and skills updated, then we're going to need to really be thinking about education that suits them, and the way that we assure their learning is something that doesn't require them to file into a lecture theatre with 500 people with their pencil and paper in hand.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, of course, can translate when they're in the workforce and the expectations at work.
Absolutely right.
Claire, we're lucky to have you in the sector full stop, given your perspective across vet, higher ed. You've gone deep into AI, not just here in Australia, but globally. And we also know that you're a signatory to the Castlereagh Declaration that has recently been launched. Can you tell us a little bit about why you think that whole of education lifestyle approach is important and what we could expect from the release of the declaration?
Well, firstly, hats off to the three driving forces behind it. Professor Danny Liu at Sydney University, Professor Jason Lodge at UQ, and Katie Ford from Microsoft. Absolutely deeply impressive in bringing educators together from right across the sector, from early childhood schools, all the way through to adult learning in the workplace. And I think what they have done, and I was honoured to be a very small part of that, but I think what that declaration does, it actually has some similarities to the OES paper on assurance of learning. It looks at what is it that we want students to be learning, how will we know when that they have learned it, and how do we continue to evolve our education and training systems and styles as the world of work changes, keeping that connection. I mean, it's not just change happening in education, it's change happening in the workplaces that students will go into. And AI is a part of that, but it is not the only driver of it. And so I think that focus on educators, their capability, what is a demonstration of learning, and then how do we assure it, is critical parts of what that declaration lands on.
Yeah, I love it. And just, yes, acknowledging, of course, that leadership, and also with the declaration released, the opportunity for many others to contribute to what that looks like across the whole sector. I want to turn to a question around optimism and the opportunities that you can see. We've sometimes this conversation is framed in the deficit that, how can we can't stop AI, we can't manage AI, and I'd love to hear from your perspective where we could be and should be optimistic about the future of learning and AI.
So there's two parts to that, if I can. The first is big data and machine learning, what we call personalised learning in education. And I have been banging this drum, sometimes feels like a bit of a solitary effort for, it seems like years. And it was well before COVID. Australia has an opportunity, and there are some institutions and their learning partners who have grappled with this. But when we look overseas at what's happening, you have mostly universities and schools, tiny pockets of that have grasped the well-researched and evidenced, not EdTech AI hype, ways in which that kind of AI can truly improve student learning. Of course, you still need educators, but it can help students progress their learning in a way that meets their learning needs where it's at. So I would like to think that maybe we're at the part of that evolution within Australia where we could be doing the same. And if we are going to do that, we could probably look to good folks like yourselves, but we could also be looking certainly to Singapore, where this has been evaluated, thought through by their government, and they've really landed it. When it comes to large language models and the kind of AI that most of our conversation in Australia has been about, I've been surprised it's taken us as long as it has to get to even where we are today with the technical assurance of learning. I really thought that it ought not be that hard to sit back and think, what do we want students to learn, and how will we know that they've done it if we have to do this differently? We now have an opportunity to be working across the sector and with employers and with those with technical expertise to really help shape what work in the future looks like and how our learners bring those skills with them. So I think there is an opportunity to be optimistic, but I think it requires system level responses to do that.
I love that. And you and I have had the pleasure of working together in many different roles, and often global outward facing roles. I wonder there if also there's an optimism about how we might export, shape or extend this approach, what we're doing here in Australia, given the, I'd say, world-class approach that Tex has taken to assurance of learning and engaging with the sector. Do you see opportunities for us to take that to the world?
I certainly do. Early on, I called it even at a TEXA conference. I was sitting in the audience and felt a need to thank them for their leadership. And it truly has been globally significant what they've done in higher education. So yes, I think there is a great deal that, because the regulator worked with providers and their partners, there are some excellent resources and there's some great practice that Australia can and should be sharing with the world. The Digital Education Council is one global mechanism that I'm familiar with, where there are a large number of Australian partners who are part of a conversation about digital education and its future. In VET, I'm sorry to say, the reverse is true. We are a million miles behind on this conversation. I have just seen that ASQA has started workshops discussing AI, and I applaud them for that. But I actually think in VET we need to be looking outwards to see what we can learn from other sectors who I think are ahead of us at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great call to action. A reminder as we're moving towards a more harmonised tertiary sector as well. It matters for every learner, but to get that right. I've got a final question for you here, Claire. I expect many of our listeners are in institutions right now, leading change, managing some of these trade-offs that we talk about in terms of, technology, relational, pedagogical, and of course, cost of change or resources to do that change. So just a piece of advice from Claire Field, how to manage those tensions and how to make sure that we're not going backwards.
I feel like I'm probably not the right person to give advice. I stepped out of working in organisations quite some time ago. I'm happy to offer advice from the outside, but I think it comes down to leadership within the sector, right? The people who are listening to this podcast and thinking about what they can do, there is some limits on what they can do, which goes to how receptive are leaders in the sector. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm across higher education and vet. So don't get me wrong, there's lots of good leaders looking to make this happen. And then I think as people are going through this, whichever part of the sector that they're in or whichever part of their institution, we need to be guided by learners, right? That's what we're here for. And if we are putting the focus on learners and their learning, I hope it doesn't sound trite, but to me, when we centralise that, we start to have different kinds of conversations rather than how can we, should we, what does it? Let's start thinking about the learner, and that then I think changes some of the conversations that we have and hopefully takes us into more forward-thinking approaches.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Claire, for joining us on the podcast today.
My absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to listen to more of the episodes.
What Claire's perspective brings into focus is the assurance question itself. If we want to maintain trust in higher education, we need to stay focused on what students are actually trying to learn, how that learning develops over time, and how institutions support students to demonstrate that learning in meaningful ways. In the age of AI, assurance of learning is not strongest where control is tightest. It's strongest when institutions are able to generate credible evidence of learning over time, grounded in how learning actually happens. Throughout this season, we've argued that this kind of assurance depends on building deliberately connected approaches, integrating pedagogy, technical systems, and the relationships between students and educators. This connected approach, grounded in how learning is designed, assessed, and evidenced over time, is key to meeting the expectations of students, regulators and employers, and for public trust in the higher education system. What comes next is a shared responsibility to keep designing assurance systems that protect standards without narrowing access, that supports students to demonstrate capability without closing doors, and that recognise learning for what it is: complex, cumulative, and deeply human. And that work belongs to all of us across the sector. I'm Amanda Ford, and thanks for joining us for this season of The Thought Bubble.